Daryl, what were some of the formative influences on your architecture?
I think really a family background of creativity would have to be a good start. And a mother who was a milliner. I now have a daughter who's a milliner. But she could always make things, and I grew up in a household where manufacture of objects was really quite important. I think that in the real start though was that I could draw. And in drawing I found a medium of expression and self sort of understanding, I think. And when I went to RMIT, it was instant. You know, the first year, the first day, almost that this was exactly where I should have been.
Right. So you'd done drawing at school? Or?
Yeah, and I'd always understood from about the age of 12 that I wanted to either be a painter or an architect. An uncle of mine suggested, well, you could go into graphics or advertising, and I just said, well, I think architects is the one. And I don't quite know why, except that this question of always wanting to make models and manufacture, build huts in the backyard, all that sort of stuff that kids do, right, just sort of grew on in. And I knew, I think, from the age of 13 that was, and I started to focus my classwork in art and history and geography and the subjects that I thought were useful for an architectural discussion.
And then when you were doing architecture at RMIT, your drawing passion was able to be realised?
Yeah, and Anne Montgomery was an artist who taught us to draw. And Evan Walker and I were both in the same year. So we used to go out sketching with Anne Montgomery. And it's this eye, mind and hand circumstance that I suppose our generation grew up with, as opposed to the computer-driven group today who can handle all of that with their computer machinery. But I think our generation really relied on this. And I was interested when Frank Gehry was on an ABC interview about a month ago, and he said, oh, it's all in the hand, the eye and the mind.
Right. So does that mean you, in a way, talk with your drawing?
Yes, and we were talking before with Matthew, and so in this office there are people that are exploring ideas that I might suggest to them, well, this is the way in which I think this could go, and maybe make a brief essay in terms of a diagram that says, well, what about this or what about that? And then I've been away for 2 days in Sydney, and so I come back and he's pretty keen to show me what he's done and is this okay? And then we have another conversation and manipulate and work the circumstances.
Right. And then once you'd finished your degree at RMIT, which was in architecture, you then made the decision to go to the University of Melbourne.
Yes.
And why was that?
I was 1 year shorter to the end.
Right.
So also I felt that in the cultural setting of how you manufactured architecture, I'd read a lot, and the course at RMIT was terrific. We had really good people teaching us history, really good people teaching us to draw, as I've said, and we had people like Kevin Borland, who was a very mature age, 27-year-old, just back from the Navy, as our studio master. And we also had people like Dr. Ernest Fuchs, who was an East German immigrant into Australia, teaching us town planning. And so this melding of the young returned soldier and the displaced person coming out of Europe made a sort of a galvanising circumstance that I think we all benefited from in this period of time, 1954 to 1958. And in 1956 the Olympics hit mid-time. Walter Gropius was in Melbourne in 1954. Yep. We had to do a poster for him, so that we did a poster for Gropius, and someone wrote a poster with Boreas on it, not Gropius.
Right.
It was immediately discarded.
Right.
I think then Melbourne University offered different challenges, I think, for those of us who went there. We were only in a class of about 15 at RMIT. Right. So there was a bigger grouping at Melbourne University, and we had to do studio work, and I thought, well, it would be good to pick up another school, another manner of education. And
so in a way you were going as a graduate from RMIT to
yes,
almost going into a graduate school.
That's true. And you'd had a good learning program of what you would call the tactile skills of making architecture, as well as a fair amount of theory. But what was missing, I think, in hindsight, was really the fine arts program that Melbourne University had. So Professor Burke was in his heyday, Franz Philipp was there, and so Bernard Smith was our tutor. So again, we lucked out, I think, in having those three people tackle us. And I think they were more important almost to me than the studio masters.
Studio offerings. So you were doing a Bachelor of Architecture at the same time at the university, experiencing people like Bernard Smith, Joe Burke, some of the great Australian art historians teaching in fine arts.
Yes.
And so you're getting the best of, in a way, both.
Both. Yeah.
Did the studio projects at the university differ? I mean, were you
Not much.
raising the suburbs of Melbourne?
No, not much. I think, I mean, it was a high point of modernism. I mean, the belief in modernism was still very strong. The Olympic pool and the Olympics had been and gone. 1957 was my first year at Melbourne, and 58. So at that time there was a consciousness in Melbourne that there were good buildings around, precious few, but enough. Boyd was in full flight.
And the Sydney Mire Music Bowl would have probably been under construction while you were a student.
Yeah, so there's a strength there, and I think the Sydney School had already started to develop its ideas, and so there was a bit of firmament in Sydney. And I then decided in 1958 that I would go to Sydney and live for a couple of years, simply to explore another city, having grown up here all my life.
And so had you worked for someone before you went to Sydney?
No, Hugh Flockhart, a really good student, no longer with us on this earth, was an eccentric person. Architecture breeds these people.
Does.
And they're fantastic minds, great abilities. And so he said, I think I'm going to Sydney. And I said, well, I'm going too. So we went off in his huge Ford car with all our books in the back and lived in King's Cross for about a year. And I got a job with Colin Madigan, as it turned out. So that was purely fortuitous.
So working for someone that would go on eventually to do the High Court of Australia and the National Gallery.
He was a very good mentor, and Hugh got a job with a guy called Sidney Smith, who is known in the sense of being a good architect.
Yeah.
And we lived in the most urban part of Sydney, and it was because I felt that living in a suburban Melbourne territory, we had not really met the city in any serious way. So,
and at that time, I guess Sydney was, in many respects, felt a lot denser and was denser. And
there were more people living in Paddington and so on. So most of that thinking led me to think about architecture in a series of different levels, which is not just the building on the plot of ground, but I start to think about how buildings in landscape, buildings in urban settings have to cohere and become part of a whole. And it's just a bigger matrix. If you're building designing a house, you've got to get all the rooms to cohere. If you're designing a number of houses or placing a house into a context of an urban circumstance, then there should be some correspondence.
So you spent some time in Sydney, and then where? Then
came back, basically to get married and to graduate formally from Melbourne University. And then Kay and I went away to work in London. We worked there for 3 years and travelled in between times. And to that extent, I'd always felt a loss of experience of the things that I had learned. I'd spent a lot of time in the Melbourne Public Library when you're at RMIT, and things were a bit dull and it was a bit wet outside. Well, the great reading room was a feast of material, particularly to write history essays and to study the texts and so on. So I'd really done an undergraduate course in urbanism without actually knowing that's what it was, but picking up on the history of cities. And so they had to be experienced, and I think many Australians at that time felt the loss of this exchange. It had all been imported rather than experienced. And as we all know now, the Australian job is to understand Western intellectual intelligence and to get it to communicate with us so that we can manufacture it in our own way and in our own experience.
And did you find your Australian experience actually was, did it equip you well for working in London?
Yeah, I think so. I think
Right.
that we emerged as competent, and having done the homework on Europe, we were actually more articulate, more versed in what was happening over there almost than people coming down from Leeds or Yorkshire
Right.
to London to work,
Right.
where of course everybody worked. There were Canadians, there were Americans, there were Frenchmen, there were Germans, switching around out of the European post-war period and coming to London to work, and it was a high time. I mean, it was.
So who were you working for?
I worked for Chamberlain, Powell and Bond.
Right. So
who were
great experts in
good
housing.
experts housing and good experts in that sector of London that they had this huge amount of work. The Barbican,
Right.
is the word I was looking for, and there were theatres in there. They were doing education in schools. And as a young person, aged 24, I was really in charge of a project at Leeds University. So you'd jump on the train to Leeds with the
Right.
drawings and go and talk to the staff architect and present library buildings and laboratory buildings. So it gave me a very good journeyman's understanding of how to have three principles, all of whom were different, but all of whom cohered, and every Tuesday you'd have to pin up your work and display your ideas to the partners.
So did that British office feel like a studio,
Yeah,
or did
it was
feel
a studio.
like a corporate
it was
office?
in a room not unlike this.
Right.
And they lived and worked upstairs. We were in the hoi polloi downstairs.
Right.
But I always had thought that the right way was a studio model. And also I thought that out of those sort of examples, that architecture is about continuous learning and learning from others.
Right. And I guess bringing clients into a studio environment is quite a powerful
Yes.
thing, that you're not operating at the corporate level
No.
all the time, that we have a particular way of working.
Yes,
Right.
in this office, when you come in the door, I enjoy taking people who come from either law or the corporate world and make them walk the walk through the studio.
Right.
And by that time we get to the back room, in which I'm on my home ground and they're not. And that just reverses the procedure.
Yeah.
And because it's all open, they can experience a room in which people are working. So it's like going into another example of that is into an editing room in a large newspaper.
Sure.
Where you see the whole spectrum of people doing different parts of the same exercise.
So in a way, it's partly educating your client about
Yes.
a different way of working,
Yes.
and hence a different way of sort of delivering
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
items
see,
that they want.
I think architecture is both aspirational and operational, and you can't dismiss either of them. And they're both intrinsic. They both work together. And so people walking through here see people working away on projects. They see things, not their project necessarily, if they don't want it to be seen,
Yeah.
but to see how we do it. And I think that exposure does cause them to think a bit about what it is they might receive.
Right. So after London?
Well, I went to America to work. Again, I think at a time it was sort of countering a vision that many Australians had, that the American processes were superior. It all had to do with the sense of gaining confidence, I think, in oneself, in a combative mind, to be prepared then to deal with not only a post-war Australia, but a new world Australia. And fortunately, in both moves, London was alive with fashion, design. The Beatles had hit. The switch when I got to America was really the sense that women were being noticed. The female revolution starts in a very serious way. And so you find yourself having to change gears and understand the nature of a new society, which is one of the most materially large shifts that I think has happened in my lifetime, is the feminist movement and the very deliberate exchange that we now have with our sons, daughters and partners was all starting in that period
Sure.
of the 60s, late
Sure.
60s.
And so you'd moved from London, recovering from the war,
Yeah.
across to work in New York or in Boston?
I tried to work in New York, and I'd been to a number of architects' offices, but they weren't hiring. You'd walk into Ian Pay's office and there'd be 6 people, and they'd all be filling in sheets, and they'd be saying, "You're good at rendering," and you'd say, "Oh yes," and you'd write rendering, you know, fantastic. And then you'd hand them through a door via a secretary, but nobody would come out to interview you.
Right.
So we didn't have much money, and we were camped out with a retired professor from Columbia, and so every day I'd go down to the heart of New York and walk Madison Avenue. I looked up the phone book, and there were a lot of architects in Madison Avenue, so I thought I'll just start at the one end of the street
And work your way up.
down. And I found an architect that liked my work. Had seen what I'd done in London,
Right.
and he said, "You should be working for someone like Paul Rudolph." And I said, "Oh, well, he's not in New York." He said, "No, but he's in New Haven. It's not that far away." So he rang Paul and said, "You should talk to Daryl Jackson. He'll be up on a train Saturday morning." And Rudolph, when I rang him to confirm that this was so, said, "Yes, come up, but I'm not actually hiring," which was their way of expressing it, "so I can't guarantee you a job." So I then found that Saarinen office was in that hamlet just beyond New Haven.
Right.
So I rang Kevin Roche and said that I'd been working in London and that I'd been advised to come and see him as well, which was not true.
Right. But what a good opportunity to see
But
two of the stars.
that's right.
Kevin Roche.
And he said, "Oh, well, I'd like to see you." And so I had the interview with Rudolph first, and he agreed and said, "Oh, that'd be fantastic. I'd like you to work with me." So Kay was waiting on the steps of the art gallery, and she said, have we got a job yet?"
Right.
I said, "Yeah, there's one here." And then we went on the bus to Hampden up the road, and I then had a second job with Roche, and I had to make up my mind, but not really, because I'd determined that the Rudolph exercise would be better. It was a smaller office, and I felt there was an affinity with some of the, I suppose, expressive work that he was doing at that time.
And at that time, Rudolph, I think, was probably still dean at
Yes, he was.
Yale.
Yes, he was.
Yale School of Architecture.
Yeah, and the benefit, as it turned out, serendipity is a great word in the English language. You find yourself, his office is right on the threshold of the lecture halls, and so Vincent Scully does this great series
of lectures.
And so whenever Scully was lecturing, let's say it's Thursday morning, you would go over there and just audit the course. You could wander in, you could sit there and learn about his understanding of that great American journey west. He starts with the emigration, and then does that western journey. And that, in a way, was a really expressive form of learning and paralleling that experience with Australia 200 years later, beyond that early exploration of America. And again, he was putting architecture into a much bigger framework of thinking, historically, geographically, socially, emigration, and you know, his lectures on Chicago, for instance, are illuminating because Saarinen himself had come there in that period.
Right. So it sounds like each place you were at,
I was lucky.
You were lucky, but also not only gaining further architectural experience, but also taking the opportunity of wherever you were to also boost your own personal education about architecture.
And the architecture building was opened at the time we were in the office, and so Pevsner came over, and so you met and talked with the guy that had written the text, and not in any major way, but you just got the feeling that these people are real. And Shemaev was living up the street from us, in his own little terrace house and courtyard housing and so on. So he was lecturing other people in the office. There were it had 12 core people, but in the holiday time there'd be another 8 Yaleys come across from senior classes.
So had he finished Community and Privacy, the book, at that stage?
I think he was probably writing it
there and then.
I don't remember it being in the text, but there were people like that. And Rudolph was very good friends with Philip Johnson, and so he said, oh, you and Kay should go down and look at Philip's house. So we went down to look at the glass house in New Canaan and met 3 other people whose names I can't remember, but there was a sort of cerebral exchange, and you realise that there is a high positioning of intelligence in architecture, of very literate people, and again, you could compare them to Robin Boyd in Australia.
Sure. Now, from the Rudolph office, do you think you took, were there things that you took to use back in your practice later and your practice now?
It was a studio model.
Again,
and you'll see a pit in the floor down there, and Rudolph had a sitting pit, and it was a really good exchange. You could sit there with others and learn from others, even though you weren't on their task.
Right.
So you found friendship pretty easily in an office, and that's where I think an open office as a forum is really a very strong ethic that I learned from there, even more so than Chamberlain, Powell and Pond. We were upstairs and we were downstairs. Yeah. But the sense that Rudolph was there and would be working in the open and would push you off the drawing board and say, here, I'll draw, and start drawing.
Right. But the office was a social environment as well as a workspace. Yeah, strong. And he advocated that.
Yeah, and you'd be working all day and all night, weekends and so on.
Right.
So it was a very strong team. He had a big exhibition in New York at the time, and most of us were strapped into place for a weekend to build basswood models and so on.
Right.
And the Americans worked very hard, and you also learned about hard work.
Sure. And I'm going to jump a bit now because you spend some time in Paul Rudolph's office, then you go to San Francisco?
Yes. I travelled for about 6 months across the States. Again, I think that the great novelists, the great social movements of the blacks up from the South made me want to go to the South of the United States. So we travelled almost down the Mississippi and through Richmond, Virginia and places like that, and then across the Southwest. And even as a kid, I'd done an essay on places of the Southwest Indians, and that all came back to me. I said to Kay, we're heading into this canyon, and up in here, this great massive Cubist architecture,
right?
You know, pre-Hispanic stuff, and Chaco Canyon, places like that, quite remarkable geographically. Then Timothy Jackson was about to be born in San Francisco, so we arrived there with 6 weeks to go, and found a job with Skidmore, Angus and Merrill.
Right. So that would have also been a different office environment.
That's
Skidmore, Angus and Merrill at the time, probably the real corporate powerhouse of American architecture.
And that was the biggest sort of studio experience. There were people there who I was in the design section, and they were at one end of the office, and a man called Chuck Bassett ran that office, but a micro studio model.
Yeah.
And then there are a whole swarm of people working all the way down a large office floor, producing documents. And at that time they were drawing with grey aprons on and pencils sticking out of here, and it was sort of like a militaristic sort of all drawing momentum, very different now.
And what sort of buildings were you working on in the
Well, I was working on the building on the corner of Burke Street and William Street in Melbourne.
AMP.
So Bassett said to me, well, you're from Melbourne, well, let's have a look at what we ought to be doing with this building. And so the establishment of the partie of the tower on that corner, right on that corner, was a recognition by him of the strength of the Hoddle grid, about which I had not thought. I mean, I wasn't bred on the Hoddle grid. It was there, and there wasn't a consciousness of it. And then I said, well, if that's going to be tall, then a low-rise L-shaped building around the other streets, which would recognise the small streets. And you open up a dialogue. So he was really pretty pleased that I was talking about that language. It's his building, not mine, but there was a really good dialogue between us about how these two forms might be. One's the antithesis of the other, the court form, and then the exclamation mark.
And in terms of serendipity too, I think he'd worked for Eero Saarinen.
Yes, he had.
So you'd had a sort of connection
it's an
back
odd
to the Saarinen
circumstance. But there is this this genealogy, I think, in Melbourne as well. I mean, there were mentors of mine who've mentored people like McIntyre, Boyd,
Sure.
and so on. And we all, I think, learned.
Yeah.
I was reasonably well equipped, I thought, and indeed, the experience of living up and growing in Melbourne has never really been seen to me to be a bad form. I wasn't leaving Australia with angst and misunderstanding. I was leaving with what I thought, albeit maybe flawed, but with what I thought was a reasonably good coverage.
Good coverage. Yeah. And your classmates from the university, at the same time you're in America, Evan Walker, who would one day become your architectural partner, is he in the States at this same time? Or
no, that was after.
Right.
And I had to come home because Evan wanted to leave. We had an agreement when we both left to one day perhaps join up. I mean, we were very good friends, and we didn't realise that his talent was where it lay, and one can't be sure ever of one's own talent in those circumstances. So I said, well, I think we'd be quite complementary.
Right.
And he had travelled around Europe for 6 weeks with Kay and I, going up to Finland and to look at northern Finland from Paris. And we'd spent a day with Alvar Aalto he was mounting an exhibition, and so we spent an hour and a half talking with him about his exhibition. That again was just serendipity, just luck.
Right.
And then Evan decided he wanted to come back. He'd been away 3 years, and he'd started the practice with getting a project called Lauriston Girls' School and the Hampton Methodist Church Hall.
Right.
And that project to do Lauriston came through Ray Featherston, who had been our tutor at the university and who was asked who was a good young architect and suggested Evan.
So he went to Canada
to do a master's degree in student housing.
Right.
And that was a scholarship that he'd won. And so he then starts a practice in Canada after 2 years and does a lot of student housing. As a result of that thesis that he'd done, the University of Toronto gave him some leads, and in no time at all he was working there. He was parallel with John Andrews at the time that Scarborough was being done.
Right. So the concerns of you both, but you particularly having extraordinarily good experience, I think, in London, New Haven and San Francisco, you then come back to Australia to do Lauriston Girls' School, but you've also been involved in other projects. I think you were looking after the Harold Holt Pool.
Yes, that
Kevin
came
Borland.
just a tad later because our offices were in Hotham Street, East Melbourne. Kevin was in a next-door terrace and I was in a terrace, and we lived above the terrace for 7 years and worked in the ground floor. So Kevin is given the project to do the Harold Holt Pool, but doesn't have the team to do it, as Kevin may not, and had 2 or 3 people. So he said, can we do this together? So we had 2 or 3 people, and so we built that team up with Kevin and I combining, and so that got developed and built with both of us having a response to each other. We'd been students and student leaders, but I mean, when I was a student, I was 17 and he was 27. I thought he was very old.
Right.
But it's not hard to get along with Kevin.
No.
And we had a good exchange at both the theoretical level as much as at an executional level.
Right. Now, architecturally, Lauriston is brick, off-form concrete.
Yeah.
It's about creating, if you like, communities of buildings and communities of spaces.
Yes.
The Harold Holt Pool, there's a lot of off-form concrete exposed block work. Do you think these were concerns that were particularly local to Melbourne, or do you think these were international concerns?
I think they're international, and I think really the point about architecture at that time was there was a universal feeling for the strength of materials, but also for a sharper view of what Wright was on about with organic materials. And Wright polishes it all into a different kind of organism. And the lead there, I think, comes from people like Sterling and Gowan out of Corbusier and Corbusier's main thesis,
right.
which I'd been interested in as a kid at RMIT. I mean, the pattern of teaching, as you know, sometimes is to find a master that you can actually learn from and see what he's doing. And Evan picked Gropius, I picked Corbusier, and Pat Houlihan, my other mate, picked Mies van der Rohe.
Right.
We were going for the top.
Yes.
And there are others in those groups that had been very influenced, like by Chancellor and Patrick and by Burley Griffin. And the presence of Griffin in Melbourne was still strong. And Geoffrey Woodfull, Charles Duncan, all moved through a framework of an organic school. I don't think we ever were conscious of, but you were just using it as a metaphor of understanding how, because I'd been painting at school, I was really interested in Cubism and Expressionism. And the most Cubist architect I could find happened to be Corbusier. And so that has always been, if you like, a component of my vocabulary and of my thinking about form and of how you can transpose form by cutting and slicing and using the section, as it were.
Right. But at the same time, probably there's a much more conscientious approach amongst the architects to thinking in a more relaxed way about planning and the grouping of functions, which in a way is parallel to your interest in form making.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other influence I think on us at that time was that Aalto's understanding of modernism being broken down into regional characteristics. And at that time Pevsner had added a chapter into his original book about regional architecture. And there were people in the west coast of America doing very different stuff to the east coast and so on. So out of that combination of elements, you recognise that there were different forms of the same thing, but being expressed differently from the Italians to the Danes to Aalto in the forests of Finland. And therefore, in Australia, I felt that we could find a positioning of ourselves via a more primary things. I mean, I did some houses with sticks and posts. My own house is one of them. But in a way, taking your point about function being loosened up, I wanted Kevin and I to make a building which expressed its composition, the closed cell space of the changing room, the open box, the sort of Mesian glass box, but this time done with timber and timber trusses and so on. And so the two pods and getting the transparency. And out of European urbanism, I'd also understood transparency, the idea of looking through buildings, of how to manufacture a vista and how to preserve the park. And he and I both locked in on that as a key base against which to compose the building.
And at the same time, I guess, a very unpretentious, at that time, approach to materials.
Yes. And they were cheap. I mean, that's the other point.
But I mean, industrial glazing, concrete block, timber, exposing it. I guess there's a sense of, one might say, spareness. But at the same time, there's, I guess, a stripping away of pretension that was probably shared by a generation.
Well, you've got to remember that in Boyd's writings at that time, there was a lot of pastiche. There was a lot of mimetic sort of views about surfaces and skins and finishes. And I thought it was necessary to clear that away. And you've used the word, I use the word Spartan. And that's a nicer word in the sense of talking to one's client. This is a Spartan view of life, not the Athenian view. And so this sense of wanting to express materialism for what it is akin to the way Aalto was expressive in timber and brick.
And I know I'm jumping in time though, but if you look at a lot of construction practices today, they are about skins.
Yes, they are.
Whether we like it or not, you know, lighter weight building. And has that, for you, in your own architecture, I know with your Stadia design, your design still holds very strong interest in the expressive nature of structure and the expressive nature of the containment of space. At times that must conflict with a construction practice which often relies today on lightweight skins.
Yeah, I think we're talking about a long time ago and a current time. And over that time, there's been a major, I was talking of a social revolution, men and women and the way they behave. There's a strong revolution in the technology in the way that was, I mean, if you wanted to do an off-form concrete building now, it would be half as costly again as having steel, concrete made off site and being brought on. But the matrix of a sports architecture structure is that it is a structure and you can't possibly hide it. Empowering stadia was very fitting to the way in which I'd started. But there is a continuing sense of that in most of the work. There are other explorations which for me haven't worked, and so you revolve back, rev back, and you realise it's. I mean, the will to form is always endemic to any architect, I believe, and you therefore have this desire to not be repetitive, to want to continue to learn from experience, and not to be repetitive. So this sense of moving on keeps a dialogue going within yourself as an individual, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't.
Sure.
But there is I suppose, a lineage of buildings from the mid-60s, let's say, to the Southern Stand in the 1980s, a strong imbibing in strength of materials and expressive power. Now you find that there is an array of other materials that one can apply, be they much more sophisticated. Now you can't use the same materialism, for instance, on a 120 Collins Street, which is a structure that's hidden and has to be hidden in a way to maintain it and sustain it.
Sure.
But the precasting was modelled in that building to still give a structuring effect of what happens when you turn a corner of a skyscraper. The corner is a rigid element, and so the precasting is modelled in that building to be dense on the corner, rather like a ladder frame, with lighter weight material, the silver, aluminium in between. So it's a gestural sense of how to get strength into a skyscraper rather than just slap it up against the sky and deal with it in glass. So there's still a bit of that stuff in there.
Right. But also what I think is interesting is you worked very closely with Kevin Borland on the Harold Holt Pool, which is a large sporting structure.
Yes.
And you've had an extraordinary career of designing major sporting structures across Australia and also internationally.
Yes.
Has that come through that initial commission, or is it an expertise that you actually built through the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, in part it's come through an appreciation of sport. I mean, I played a lot of sport as well, but that's nothing to do with it. I think just the sense of being able to address problem solving in a strong manner is really part of the mechanics of being able to understand what it is you're dealing with, and then applying that into another architectural sort of exposition, I suppose. Right. So the functionalism is there, but it's also there to be reinterpreted and redeveloped into something that people didn't think they wanted, maybe.
Right. No, like I'm just thinking of also your sectional drawings are quite stunning, and often in designing a structure or a stadium, the sectional drawing is absolutely key. Yes, it's true. So it would have been key.
Works.
It works. And
it's also like the cubist slice, and as Picasso rotates the face, so you see the face in elevation and in section. And there are a number of buildings of mine that I want to expose the interior substance via an external ingredient, and like looking from the inside, but you're also seeing some of the outside. So there are many compositional developments that occur, but they're not always with the same or similar materials. But you're right about the stadia. They're hard to hide, and therefore it's not until the current technologies have come about in the last 10 years, for instance. If you take the square stadium that Cox's are doing, we didn't have the capability to deal with that. We didn't have the capability to do a roof on Spencer Street Station that Grimshaw was brought to the picture. And quite clearly, in working with other architects as we're doing in terms, there are various experiences that can be brought together in an intelligently driven thing. So authorship is fused in many ways in a long career by other people entering into it. And so in my mind, you must be consciously able to absorb new devices, new ways of thinking. Otherwise, you paint yourself into a corner. That's the sort of thinking that I don't like much. That's why I like young people in this office setting up challenges where they can, accepting the view that I have a view, because it's on my banner that it goes out.
Sure.
It's just not to say we have a huge array of fights in here, but there is a certain degree of challenge and acceptance of challenge in the way in which we work.
Daryl, just to jump to recent projects, what are you currently working on?
There's 2 hospitals right there.
Right.
One with, which is in Cairns, which is half a hospital, and it's a new series of theatres, operating theatres, and up above some ward blocks. And so we're working with a Queenslander, Deb Fisher, Dale Fisher's daughter.
Right, I was at university with Deb.
Yeah, so she was here on Monday.
Right.
So she has a practice there, and when you move into regional Australia, I'm always conscious of the fact that there are other architects around and should be working to benefit their experience. And that's what I do in Perth when I work with my old friend Peter Hunt.
Right.
But Deb, but also those states and those local governments do want a fair apportionment of the salaries to be spent in their own town. So you can't work in Darwin without having a 40%, 60% circumstance in terms of local architects getting 60 and architects coming from elsewhere, perhaps 40. So there's McConnell Smith and Johnson from Sydney, who are the health planners. Deb and her partner Buttrose up there, and then our office in Queensland.
Right.
So then I'm here in Melbourne. So there's a quartet of elements that have to be fused together. So it's really how you can draw all that together in the one thing and still express a feeling for a hospital that's out on the promenade at Cairns, but not in the heart of Melbourne.
No. So that issue of a collaborative process of design, the joint venturing of a number of offices, is actually an incredibly complex process, which, given that those were similar ventures which you had to participate in with the 2 enormous projects of the Melbourne Cricket Ground, how do you do it?
Well, I think by consistent dialogue and definition of what the object is about. I say that if you're forming a team, then the object of that which you manufacture is the paramount galvanising piece. It's the thing that has to adhere. We're not here just for Daryl Jackson, we're here for this. So hence the name MCG5 was brought about because there was a participatory point. On the other hand, you have to then see that in that new matrix of people, anyone can have an idea. Therefore, you must not be possessive about your idea.
Sure.
And you've just written a piece in the Boyd book there with 2 others, so I know that you can do it.
That's right.
But this question of not sublimating oneself, but understanding that this direction, driven by someone else, is maybe a superior idea. And so I think architects often are educated to deal in ideas, but they're not very good at throwing them away.
No, well, I was going to ask, that process which you're describing, Did you experience that in your university education? Probably not.
Probably not.
No.
No, and more often than not, you felt you had the one idea and that was it.
Yeah, right.
And you persevered through all the nights and days drawing it up laboriously, only to find it slashed
at the
put
end.
down at the end.
But do you think also too that need to collaborate as a professional is actually also draws from the fact that the complexity of the building and the raft of consultants, but also the raft of complexities financially and structurally, has necessitated that need to be able to
Well, I think
collaborate?
so. You see, I think people talk of the auteur in terms of movies.
Yeah.
And in the 1930s, the auteur was there with these two cameramen and a sound recording person. They made the movie.
Yeah.
Now we've got a cast of, the credits of a film almost last as long as the film itself. So the role of the movie director is really dealing with the narrative, the plot, and you might come along as a key actor, as you are, and move in and say, I think I could do this in this part. Sure, I would say, try that part. Doesn't quite work there, Philip, but it works fantastically well there, we'll do it this way. Yeah. Then if you can sense that observation, then you will deal with that. Right. It's not that different.
So do you think that's in a way where the architect's role is being more, in large-scale projects, being redefined? Or
redefined, but it also has to have some stringing together of the pieces. Otherwise it's a bit like a fruit salad that all has the fruit start whole and gets cut up. Yeah. So there has to be a line in the sand about the intelligence of the project itself that everybody has to adhere to. So there are times where people have to set aside their idea because there's a stronger idea there. And if you took, for instance, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, the genealogy is that the focus of what's happening is what's happening in there. So you've already got in the bowl a radiating form like a saucer. Yep. So once you say to everybody, that's the genesis of this problem, then whatever else we do, that's it. Yeah. And you can't suddenly say, well, we'd like to chip a bit out of here and do that. It's not on. No. Because you're trying to get as many people focused on that space as you can. On the other hand, when you approach a convex object, the object is always going away from one. So it's like a theatre, it's not drawing you in. So the sense of the second device was well, how to make stuff that has a portal and opens up. Sure. And in the old Southern Stand, I pulled the staircases out, almost like fire guards, and stood them up, and so you could see people walking up. And it takes the activity of the person to be walking up to welcome the people that are still outside in the queue. Yeah. So it's like the queue going up. And that sense of taking a social model and applying it to a physical model where so far stadia had already had the backs around them, and if you looked at any stadia around the world up until the present time, they were built in a defence model rather than an acceptance model. You were never encouraged to go. Yeah. And you had to keep the bandits out, or the other side, or the other team. Yes. Whatever. So that sense of running an empowering argument with a team of three others that are combining with you is important. On the other hand, in most architectural practices, we don't all do the same things very well. So you may say that in a combination, like an MCG5, there's a Philip Cox and there's a Pat Ness, there's myself, there's Peter Cole over here, and that HOK, whilst they'd made a contribution, brought some technology, they brought also a project manager type down. Right. So then you've got a team of, it's like, again, the movie, there's sound recordists or a theatre operation in a medical circumstance. I think if you get 5 people coming together all wanting to do the same thing, you end up with the disaster that was like the Grounds, Romberg and Boyd practice. Yes. Each on their own had worked on their own and had never worked in collaboration as young people. No. And therefore learning to live with each other is a value that Gropius was talking about, the teamwork, but even so, there were enough fights in the Bauhaus
Yes.
know that that wasn't altogether
That's
peace.
right. And I think it is a rare art to actually make a collaboration work.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I found in Madigan's office in Sydney a very collaborative man where he is a deep-seated philosophic person, and he recognised what talent I had and allowed me to do what I was doing, and he was teaching me and I was learning from him.
Right.
But he now says to me, I realise now that we were teaching each other in funny ways. So he's now 89.
So Daryl, now you have a number of offices.
Yes.
Where are they?
Okay. The closest one to here is Canberra, then Sydney, then Brisbane, and then here. So it's 4 on the east coast, which are key offices.
Right.
I work in Perth with Peter Hunt because he and I work together at Chamberlain, Powell and Bond.
Good heavens. So these are lifelong connections.
They're lifelong connections. So he comes back, he was a Perth boy, and he says, look, I'm not the architect you are, but we've got the opportunity to do a stadium in Perth. Will you come and do it with me? Would you come and help me do a conservation project, because I'm not very good at that. So he doesn't enter into the dialogue, he orchestrates the project.
Yep.
And that was happening really in New Haven with Paul Rudolph. Right. Paul Rudolph had the enormous talent, and to get major jobs, you would find he did that whole of that Boston Centre with a key office in Boston, a bit like the Skidmore, Owings and Merrill of Boston. I can't remember their name. I was sent down to New York from the office with a project for the IBM in New York as the project design architect, making sure that a firm called Walter Kidder Incorporated down in Wall Street had 2,000 employees drawing the working drawings of this project on huge mylar sheets. I sat in a corner and they'd parade up with their sheets and I would tick or cross correct to see that the detailing was being done. There'd be a few fights. Mr. Rudolph I'd ring him up and say, they're not really listening. And he said, well, I'll come down Friday. He'd walk in. His photograph had been on the Time magazine and everybody's falling all over him. So it was like a football star walking in. And all the problems went away. And then he went away and he said, what was all that argument about? But in that sense, there are two kinds of collaboration.
Yeah.
And I think genuinely, if people feel that you're better off doing this, it's really like playing in a game.
Yeah.
If you can bat and bowl, that's great. But if you're only a good bowler, we don't want you opening the batting.
So 4 offices on the East Coast.
Peter,
1 in Perth, and offices internationally?
Yeah, I worked with John Lyle in London at his behest. I was there for 10 years with my own office. I then realised that there were more experiences better off here. And as my kids were growing older, so Kay and I didn't want to spend that time away. And also, you feel that as an Australian, there is another contribution to be made. I was chairman of my old school, I was doing other chores. And I just feel that it's like living in Hong Kong. You can live there for a few years, but you couldn't live there with a depth of commitment to one's society.
Yeah.
It's why you're a professor in Melbourne and why I like being in Melbourne.
Yeah.
And therefore it's not to do with any tangible financial circumstance. I think it's to do with where you believe you can
make your greatest contribution and commitment.
So,
Daryl, in terms of advice that you might give to graduates, prospective graduates, as they're facing issues of global urbanisation, issues of sustainability now. I mean, what advice do you give a graduate? I mean, you've had an extraordinary range of experiences and built up those experiences to when you finally went into practice, you were hugely well equipped, I think.
Good.
What advice would you give students?
I think it's very important that you start to define yourself. Authorship is very important, and therefore being able to become confident in some area or zone of what architecture may be is often a link into becoming even better in other aspects. but you may not encompass it all at once.
Yeah.
And the 5-year journeyman experience that I talk about, whilst we've condensed it to 5 minutes or 7 minutes or whatever it is, was a gradual osmosis of picking up conversations, picking up books, picking up lectures, and a continuing learning program. So the first thing I would advise to people is try to find where you think your talents lie, and if they are really expressed talents in documentation and the manufacture of architecture, you can have a very healthy and positive career there. If you have an instinctive creative mind and believe that you can write the novel, so to speak, then you should try to do that.
Yeah.
You may want to start small, but that's not necessarily now these days. Both Tim Jackson and myself started our respective careers off various uncles and aunties and things like that, because you're a Melbourne-based person. But for people coming from overseas, how do they start? How do they go back into Southeast Asia and start? And it's very difficult to even address that issue for them. But I think that all the educators can do and all the studio can do is try to develop the best talents where one sees them. So not everybody in this room has equal merit and equal talent. And part of my task is to say, look, I think you would be best suited to tackle this issue. And if they say, no, I don't want to do that, well then maybe there isn't room for them here in that sense. But I think you've got to be true to yourself and have sufficient confidence and secondly, self-critique. And self-critique is often the hardest. If you've married a good lady, you'll get it from her.
Yeah, I'd agree.
And I think that travelling with Kay and having lived our lives together is a fantastic exchange between us, which offers critique and observation about who we are and how we are. If you're trying to do that alone, I think that's a much harder task.
Much harder thing, yeah.
And also working in offices where there's a sense of collaborative energy does bring people into circumstances.
So what do you see then the future challenges, for architecture?
I think is a greater sense of effectiveness in terms of technical understanding and intellectual understanding. I suspect that we're living in a very complex, more complicated world than the 1950s were for me at a similar age. On the other hand, the faith in the youth is that they don't see it as complex. It's maybe only us.
Yes. Me. No, that's right.
And so that sense of being able to handle a sufficient number of elements is really part of the wider discourse of architecture, the wider discourse of all the elements that manufacture architecture, which we, in terms now, use the word cultural. We say we're working in a cultural milieu as a painter or a writer or an architect. And our culture is about diversity and continuing learning about diversity. And architecture over the last 30 years has gradually splintered away from mainstream to side stream to offside stream to now being like a river with many tributaries through it. And the tributaries are not in competition with each other, but it's okay for one river to be coming in from there and another coming in from there, and you finding its own course within the other course. I suspect that 30 years ago we were all looking through the prism of modernism as the one thing. Yeah. You had to be this, and you had to kill off every other species that was around that. And therefore, when you were selecting your supposed style, now you don't ask people to do it. Or you do.
But how do you teach or encourage architectural judgment? Or aesthetic judgment?
I thought that was your job.
Right.
But architectural judgment, I think, comes about through dissemination of 4 key elements in architecture. Firstly, I think all problem solving is about form, structure, content and meaning. not necessarily in that order.
No.
You might have to write the movie backwards, where you start with the end,
Yep.
and the meaning then becomes apparent as the movie goes along. Often in our imaginative forms, I'm looking for the meaning of what this problem is about without quite knowing what form it's going to take. And therefore, I might be reading something that's radically apart from any architectural book, whatever. I read a lot, I like reading. And I might be reading a history of some kind, and that causes my mind to engage in my inner dialogue. So meaning can come in at any point, and I suspect we're living in a world of significant points of difference in meanings, and therefore why should I deny Greg Burgess what he does? I don't do what he does. Yeah, he worked for me and I enjoyed him working for me, but I can't do what he does, and he doesn't do what I do. But why should I pin him to the wall and say he's wrong and I'm right? But often that's how architects tend to work. I don't actually have that coloration. I think there's all the colours in the rainbow to be addressed, and therefore architecture as a universal field of inquiry can deal with those to greater or lesser degree. And you must learn, you were asking about how to criticise a student's work. You must criticise, in my mind, relative to the work they've produced for you. You can't suddenly say, well, you haven't done, you can say, you haven't, in your own terms, you haven't done it well enough. But you can't say, well, you should be over here in the grey area rather than painting in blue. And so I suspect that being truthful about those lines of narrative or the tributaries that you're in are significant. But I think we're seeing a more, when we talk of globalisation, we're looking for a whole world to work up. We're not just looking for Australia to be alive and well. And we now know in the environmental circumstance how significant all the interfaces are in terms of knock-on effect or valued effect. Sure. So I think it's that carrying that simile back into the object. And design, as we were always taught it, were about the object having its own personality, and within that you develop the details to live with it as a grammar and a vocabulary. I think those things are still true, but they're true in a sort of a bigger telescope, as it were. I don't think they've changed, literally.
No. So do you have a position on the ability to draw by hand and digital technology?
No, I think these guys are fantastic, but I'm still producing drawings. I mean, this is some stuff here that we're working with the Coxes on a project, and their guys did this, and I'm drawing over it and saying, well, can you now do that? Can you change?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether they've done that first and we've done this. We had a conference about how this would go, and is it a shell form, and so this is just a first thrust. So in the process of manufacture, it's going to be a project which is a combination of perhaps 3 to 5 different efforts, and it's how you do it that start to generate the...
Right, so what you're getting at it really is whether it's done by hand or digitally, it's an iterative process. And that's one of the key aspects of design.
Yes.
And it has to be if you're going to work with other people.
That's true. Yeah. No, I think just really trying to explain that and to not be defensive. I think we're always taught in our authorship to be a bit too defensive. Yeah. And I think architecture still carries that conviction that you can't be the batsman or the bowler. Yeah. I don't think other professions have it to anywhere near the same degree.
No, they don't. I mean, I think partly has to do with how we record what people have done. Yeah. Architects like the art history approach.
Yes.
You know, Michelangelo or Bernini.
Yes.
But in actual fact, they also worked with teams of
course,
other players. But the art historians will write it up as, you know, the genius.
Yeah, and I think it's a narrow, out-of-date kind of vision for most of the things we manufacture. Yeah. And I think it's more normal to think the other way. That is, that there are many people can write the novel, many people can strike a match, but you've got to have respect for the impact of what the match is lighting.
Yeah. Daryl, in terms of urbanisation and the whole notion of the city, I guess we're now reaching a stage where urbanisation at an enormous scale is inevitable.
Yes.
How do you respond to that as an architect?
Well, I think we find it hard to get into the picture as an architect.
Right.
And there's no government agency that's really saying to key architects in this city or around Australia, why don't you join up with this planning team and look at a vision for the city or a circumstance for the city? Yeah. We get dragged into it mostly by state governments that want economic and functional paradigm first, but not necessarily intellectual or social construct.
Right.
And so this, there's a double act that's not coming together.
Right.
Where they're either subservient to a developer-led exercise and not engaging in a respectful, bigger picture with the Department of Planning or whatever. I think that. And
you think architects can do that? Be in a way strategic. It is a way thinking strategically about the city.
But again, I think our educational pattern making starts the process, and then when students leave the university, they all go their own way, and they're in a line function job.
Yeah.
And therefore, trying to be the generalist, and I'm often, as a variety of work that I've done, I'm often asked to be a master planner, to evaluate other people's work and to see how it can adhere or not. And I just sense that there's a failing about the city as a fabric, and you can't imagine quite how it's going to actually get better. I'm a bit despondent about it.
Right.
And as chairman of the Heritage Council, I'm really trying to sustain those values of that which is important to the city. And that poster behind you that you perhaps have seen really is about drawing attention to the fact that 39 buildings in the blocks between Flinders Street and La Trobe Street are key Victorian buildings of heritage kind. And so my mission for the minister was to say, well, that's your job. No high-rise in those blocks, which was Evan's old idea.
That's right.
But we've got to keep recalling that. But I drove around Sydney last night to go out to Balcombe Hills where we're doing a project, and it's just heterogeneity, it's just hit and miss, there's no coherence. And I suspect that whilst we can coherent about a particular project on a patch of ground, we should be working the bigger picture.
So is that a task for, I mean, I'm interested, you say that you do a lot of master planning, but you're an architect.
Yes.
And you're a planner?
Yes. No, I'm not a planner, not
an urban designer?
No.
No, but you do all of those things
automatically. Yes.
I mean, it's interesting that they're the skills that an architect might have.
Yes.
But they all should be skills which a planner could have, an urban designer could have.
Yeah, I think it's partly when I say I was a generalist, I've thought widely over projects, and therefore finding the right diagnosis for the whole of the frame. It's the difference between the wellness idea and the heart specialist. It's cut your heart out and kill you, if that's the case. But the understanding of really the whole model is very important. So we're doing a project in Perth where we're talking about the parkland, we're talking about the Subiaco ground, we're talking about the Subiaco centre, and how to bring all those energies together. There is no one client. The client is the Subiaco Footy Club or whatever it is, and they want this, and to hell with what the rest of it is, and they're leaving the architect to put in the good word with Subiaco to get it right. And so to engage with Subiaco Council, there might be a reaction, or you've got a car parking problem or something. You just don't kind of get the bits to come together.
No.
And I think we're not very good at that. And urbanism, I think, is about policy setting. There's a funny sort of bit for you. I gave you that's a talk I was giving about these three things coming together. We live in public and private realms. Faulkner Park, as the metaphor, is really capable of having private picnics in it, but also public cricket and football. And it's really making sure those pieces can adhere that I think is important. And I think it's hard for us to come out of an architecture school with an architectural degree, and I might be the last of a body of people that didn't have to have a particular specific disciplinary degree to enter into dealing with landscape, dealing with the urban planning.
Yeah.
I mean, I have views on all those things, and you know, people like Track to come in and do work for us, and they say, "Well, you've got a view on this." I say, "Yeah, the building doesn't stop right on this boundary; it comes to here."
Yeah.
And always I've thought about how does the building meet the landscape? How does it interface with the road, the street, the rest of it? And therefore, they're all key bits in my sort of desires.
Yeah. Daryl, much of your architecture is public.
Yes.
You know, you've done schools, universities, buildings, you've done research laboratories, you've done stadia,
Yes.
You've done public housing.
Yeah.
I mean, I like the idea that, and the diagram, you know, has this public and private
Yes.
as poles. Do you see that an architect's role is a sort of public duty?
Yes, I do. I'm very conscious of the fact that it's not a public duty. It's a duty of all architecture to be seen to be public.
Yeah.
To that extent, I think it's like a book that's there to be read or a painting that's there to be viewed. The completion of the creative act is not until somebody comes and looks at my painting.
Right.
And therefore, when they come to the painting and look at it, then the artist might feel the intensity of the exchange. And that's what we're doing in life together.
Yeah.
We're really educating people between yourself as a professor and the student. Between you both, there is that engagement. It's not you and it's not me as the student. It's this encounter. And I think in all architecture, the encounter is not just to do with the client and the object. It's really to do with the client, the object, and the object in perpetuity, if it is to have perpetuity. I've suggested that architecture is mortal, and therefore you expect it to live and breathe and die in the 20th century. There are insufficient buildings that you know, transpose mortality to immortality.
Yeah. But just on that, the project you did in Sydney for the conservatorium,
yes,
I think is a very interesting one, because you have a building by Francis Greenway,
yes,
and others, which you had to work around because it's been seen to be almost immortal.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And then you have to provide the setting for that building, and yet at the same time, I think the additions you've made to it will have, without doubt, an extraordinary longevity because of the sensitivity that you've given.
Well, I like to think that. No, thank you for the compliment. We wrestled long and hard as to whether we should take the commission. There
really?
were a lot
to take it?
Yeah, because there were a lot of people against the idea. They wanted to, I mean, purists in terms of preservation would have ripped the Veerbruggen Hall out of it and gone back to Greenway pure and simple.
Yeah.
Maybe had horses in there as well, I don't know. But I'm more interested in urbanism as a palimpsest, as the way in which we continue to think about civilization as a series of layers growing one over the other over the other. There's a genealogy about it. And so we didn't take long to decide, but there was a sense that Robin and I said, oh, you know, is this going to be hard? And we said, yes, it is. And there was some people champing at the bit at Chris Johnson, who was our client, and who took most of the rubbish, as it were.
Right.
And he and the Premier stood fast, and they said, well, no, we're going to do this. And so we worked into the ground and laminated away from the building that'd been there and built an underground building. Right. And Bob Carr said to me, well, what will it look like from the back? I said, it won't have a back, Bob. It'll have 4 fronts. But you won't see one of them because we want to paint it dark green and have ivy grow over it. So it's like a garden wall. So when you see the base building coming out of the cliff, it really is like an escarpment. And therefore, the metaphor of it being a garden building or garden wall building, I think all those devices are there in our vocabulary, and it's how to make them valid against other criteria.
Sure.
And again, I feel that architecture tends to want to run a monologue with itself rather than a dialogue. And you saw in that thing, I was impressed with the 5 or 6 we had at the review of the master plan on that for a month ago or more now. But I thought there was really a very good consensus about the array of people there doing different things and moving around teams. So I thought that was a really positive thing. I've seen other university buildings where, even though you were the master planner, you can't get the architect to get the point that that building's got to live with others and be part of if you like, a genetic coding to Melbourne University.
Yeah, the family.
The family. And, you know, if you look at most universities in Australia, there's a failure in all that respect. I can't take anybody to a great campus that feels like it's got some substance to it.
No, that's right.
And I'm looking at Deakin in Burwood, and again, even the people commissioning the buildings don't quite know what I'm talking about. Yeah. There's a DNA about it, I keep saying.
Yeah.
So again, I think this sense of being able to move students through a lens that says, on the other side of your discourse, there's an array of wider things for you to take note of. And therefore, we can only get them so far. If they work in a good office, they'll learn from their other peers. But often they don't, and therefore I think they still go out repeating the same thing. Their last project becomes their only project.
Yeah. Daryl, probably to finish up, what's your favourite building that you've produced?
I saw that on your list, and I said, no, there's 10 of them.
Oh, there's 10 of them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, it's not a very fair question, I know. But
in a way, there are some that, for one reason or another, become more memorable and more significant. I must say that the Southern Stand at the MCG registers because it was the first really major public building. And you know, you're a bit petrified at this stage as to how that's going to be responded to. So that is as strong in my mind as the first of those, which is the one with Kevin out in Harold Holt Pool territory. Within that, there's an array of others, but they're just things that impact on your mind, which cause them to be somewhat special.
Sure.
As opposed to a really lovely house we've just finished in Hawthorne, which is a really super house, mostly because of its lightness of touch within a mature garden. So it's got none of the muscular stuff, but it's really the opposite of it, and it's steel and it's tensioned up, and it's really in Shakespeare Grove. It's very modest when you see it from the street, but when you go out into the back, there's some photographs kicking around. I'll show you when we finish.
Right.
But I was going to put that into the exhibition.
Okay. All right. Because I guess my smart aleck answer to that would have been, well, my next building.
Yes.
But because I think, you know, you as a practitioner, you've been in practice for more than
50 years.
Golly, 50 years now.
Yeah, this year.
And there's no sign of stopping.
No, well, hopefully
and
not.
And in a way, that's what architects do.
Yes. Yeah, well, Neil Clerihan's still working.
Still practicing.
Yeah, Gary is 80-something.
That's right.
Yes.
And I know that often when we talk to students when they're beginning a program, we say, you know, we're only giving you 5 years or 2 years. Yeah. There are decades more to come. Yeah. And I think what's extraordinary about your work is that it is a constant reinvention.
Yes.
Well, but there are consistent themes.
There are consistent layers through it if you pull that apart. I was teaching in Perth last year, and a student, I'd asked them to look at a description of why they all came into the city at the weekend as opposed to stay in the suburbs. And I said, would you describe a journey of what happens at each station along the way? What do you see when you look out? And half of the kids said, we don't actually look, we don't see things. I said, well, you know, observation is the first rule of architecture. Yeah. And if you can't describe what you're seeing in a useful way, then what is it that happens at this city? Oh, well, there's more people here and there's great fun and more shops, more choice and so on and so on. I said, well, I know that's the answer. And I know that you don't find that happening out there. So I asked them to do some drawings of each of these things. And it was a workshop over a weekend, and at the end of the Saturday, a Chinese guy had drawn a very tiny drawing. It was about this big. I couldn't see it. It was a little cross-section. He had drawn a cross-section of one station being inside the next, being inside the next. Oh. It was falling down. Right. And I couldn't tell what you were looking at. And I said, look, this is a terrific drawing, but overnight I want you to draw this up to something like 3 metres by 3 metres on big sheets of butter paper. And you three guys over there, you'll have to help him because he won't reach the top of the drawing. So I had these 3 Australian guys to help the Chinese boy do it. So the next morning, they all showed their material. And I got Mr. Wong, I think that was his name, and I said to him, this is a beautiful drawing, and you've now got it right. Can you go down the end of the hall? I want you guys to pin it up, and you will run down the hall and jump through it. And he said, what for? I said, well, once you jump through it, you will have possessed it. It's yours. You're the author, you've done it. You'll remember me asking you to do this for the rest of your life. And he said, wow, he ran down. And he jumped through, and all the crowd of 40 others in the class all clapped and cheered. Right. And he came to me and he said, that's the first time I've ever been noticed.
Daryl.
So isn't it? It isn't that just one of those? I was making this up as I went along. I had no primary view, but it just is a sense of what I think about some of the things we've been talking about is trying to possess the territory you know best, and then trying to espouse it and pursue it in a way that makes sense is, I think, a key. Anyway, he went away very happy.
Great. All right. Well, Daryl, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for the chat.